I have never hated an anime more than I hated Dragon Ball GT. I can remember sitting down and watching this show in my parents' living room, staring unblinkingly at the screen and just seething over this show. The long-awaited sequel to Dragon Ball Z instead felt like an insult to everything that made the original series great. And I'm not alone in that. GT is one of the most reviled anime in existence, with fans of the series bitterly arguing if it's even a canonical part of Dragon Ball. And so today, a decade and a half later, I want to return to GT and ask, what was it about that show that made me feel so angry, and were those feelings justified? I'm going to try and not come across like the unhinged Dragon Ball Z fanboy this intro has undoubtedly made me sound like, but the chances of me failing in that are, well, high. If I was to break down the core appeal of Dragon Ball Z into the fewest words possible, it would be growth through struggle. Dragon Ball Z is at its heart a story about trying your hardest in the face of the impossible and using that hardship to surpass what you are and becoming what you need to be. I'm going to try and not get too sentimental here, but that was a message that meant a lot to me as a teenager. A teenager who had no real idea how to read people and felt disconnected from everyone and everything. But those problems faded when watching Dragon Ball and seeing the characters of Z continuously fight against odds that felt not just overwhelming but insurmountable. And it contextualized the idea for me that struggle did not mean defeat. That hardship could push you to greater things in a way that honestly helped me through some of the most difficult times of my entire life, and oh god, I have failed entirely at the opening statement of this paragraph. And I'm not alone in that. There's a reason Dragon Ball Z meant so much to so many, and even to this day, when there's hundreds of different shonen anime all working from the same template laid out by DBZ, while I can think of a handful that I consider better stories, I can't think of any that more successfully capture those core themes of hardship and progression. I bring all this up because I think it's important to understand the emotional connection fans had with Dragon Ball, and how that created expectation for GT. GT was set 10 years after the final episode of Dragon Ball Z and starts immediately with a wayward Dragon Ball wish transforming Goku back into the body of a small child. And this presents a major problem for GT in regards to the fans who had already fallen in love with Z. From the first time Goku had fired a Kamehameha to the final Majin Buu obliterating Spirit Bomb, progression had always been a huge part of Goku's character. And if you had been watching Dragon Ball Z from an early age, chances are you had kind of grown up with Goku. Battle through battle, you had watched his journey of struggle and growth, and by the end of it, it felt like you had taken that journey with him. And that was an experience that meant a lot to people. And so, immediately transforming Goku back into the body of a small child felt like a betrayal of that experience. For the first time in the character's history, his progression was halted, and in its place was what felt like a transparent attempt to appeal to a much younger audience. And that was a feeling palpable in the first 16 episodes of GT. Rather than the long villain-centric arcs of Dragon Ball Z, what we got instead were much shorter, simpler, episodic-style stories that saw Goku, his granddaughter Pan, and Trunks travel from planet to planet in search of the Black Star Dragon Balls, with a lighter, breezier tone that felt much more geared towards young children than the intense, violent action of Z. Pan would be kidnapped by a group of alien bees mistaking her for their queen, Trunks would wear a dress in order to fool an evil monster, and Goku would become hypnotized by a group of mischievous dancing mercenaries. And the problem wasn't that these episodes were bad, it was that if you were a teenager who had become invested in the more intense emotional battles of Z, the writing was on the wall. Dragon Ball was no longer for you. This continues for the entire first quarter of the series until, around episode 20, things start to change. The child-friendly adventure stories become less frequent, and more of the episode's runtime are filled with flashy battles that feel reminiscent of the later encounters of Z. Until in episode 22, Goku and crew encounter Baby. And Baby's introduction into the series is significant, as it marks a return to the villain-centered story arcs of Dragon Ball Z. And I want to give credit where it's due here. Even as a teenager, I remember really liking this group of episodes. The scene that Baby's introduced is actually really well directed and has this thick, ominous sense of dread to it. Baby being a biological weapon created by an extinct alien race who suffered genocide at the hands of the Saiyans. Baby himself, hell-bent on claiming vengeance for his fallen masters, and so travels to Earth, infects the entire population, and in doing so, turns all Goku's past allies against him. And as the series starts to build to the inevitable showdown between Goku and Baby, it's the first time GT starts to elicit those old Dragon Ball feelings. Which is why then it's such a disappointment that the actual fight with Baby is such a letdown. Each major fight in GT follows a very simple formula. Goku and his opponents engage in a back and forth of energy blasts and escalating power levels until Goku defeats the enemy with one of his 3 finishing moves. Which on the surface could be used to describe a lot of the fights from Z, so what's the difference? Well, one critical thing: narrative. There was a storyline running through each of the major encounters of Z that went beyond just stopping a bad person from doing a bad thing. Rather, the fights in Z had personal significance to each character. And this is something I've talked about in one of my other 37 videos on Dragon Ball, but fuck it, I'm gonna do so again and no one can stop me. Take for example one of my favourite fights in Z, Android 18 versus Vegeta. Action-wise, there's not really a whole lot going on in this fight, and visually there's much more interesting encounters in Z, but what makes it special is its place in Vegeta's story. Think about Vegeta's emotional state here. After a lifetime of trying, he's just turned Super Saiyan for the first time, and has used that power to obliterate Android 19 in one of the most vicious curb stompings of the entire series. And in his mind, he's finally achieved everything he's always dreamed of. He's an invincible Super Saiyan and the true legacy to the Saiyan race. And the tension of this fight comes from Vegeta's slow realization that Android 18 is not only as strong as him, but she's actually far more powerful, with the conflict ending in a disastrous, humiliating defeat for the Prince of Saiyans. That both conveys just what a threat the androids are, as well as spiraling Vegeta into a state of intense self-loathing, planting the seeds for his heel turn that would come later in the Majin Buu saga. And so, even though the actual fighting of this scene is relatively simple, what made it compelling was its place in a grander narrative. It was part of Vegeta's story, and affected him on a personal level, with each fight and transformation that follows being another chapter in that story. And these are the stories that define the major encounters of Dragon Ball Z. Goku's brutal, torturous battle with the impossible against Frieza, that was the culmination of his lifetime of training and every other battle that had brought him to this point, the desperation of which surged him into becoming a Super Saiyan. Or Gohan's realization that the existence of Cell meant the eradication of all life, and that pacifism was no longer an option. That epiphany pushing him to a level beyond Super Saiyan. This is what made the fights of Dragon Ball Z matter. And also what makes the fight with Baby such a disappointment. There is no personal narrative. Rather, what we have is a bad guy trying to do a bad thing, and a good guy trying to stop him. There's never the sense that the fight carried any real emotional weight for either combatants, and so it meanders on for nearly 10 episodes, the only notable occurrence being the introduction of Super Saiyan 4. And in theory, this should have fixed a lot of the problems I had with GT. It is, after all, a new power level and a significant sign of growth, while also aging Goku back up to the body of an adult. But without the actual narrative that led to this moment, it doesn't mean anything. In Dragon Ball Z, a transformation marked a big, significant moment in the lives of these characters, something they had struggled and bled their whole lives to achieve, and so it felt monumental and joyous when it finally happened. But that journey, that struggle, we'd never get that with Super Saiyan 4. Instead, the build for Super Saiyan 4 involves a group of aliens using a giant pair of pliers to pull a tail out of Goku's butt. There's never any scenes of Goku passionately training to achieve his new state. We don't get the emotional revelation that forces our heroes to ascend. All we get instead is a literal ass pull. Thank you. The reason the showdown with Baby is such a disappointment is it's like a fight from Dragon Ball, but without the emotion that gave it meaning. And without that personal narrative, without that emotional journey, the fights of GT may look like Dragon Balls, but they never feel like it. Instead, just becoming empty, glorified light shows, and without the exceptional choreography of Toriyama's panels, not even especially entertaining ones. This problem only intensifies with the latter two arcs of the series, which centered around two new villains, Super 17 and Omega Shenron. And there's things I like about both these characters. 17's design is a really interesting evolution of the originals, and the concept behind Omega Shenron, an evil dragon born from overuse of the Dragon Balls, is an interesting take on the series lore. But whereas Baby had story build-up and actual motivation, those are not luxuries afforded to either of these characters. The showdowns with them begin nearly immediately after their appearance, with no real preamble or any setup, meaning they never have a chance to develop a sense of identity beyond the idea that they are strong and hold an ambiguous desire to do evil because they are evil. And that's not a criticism I would level at the villains of Z. Frieza was this malicious, violent space racist who also had this eloquent way of speaking that nearly would have made him charming if every word out of his mouth wasn't soaked in a seething disdain for everyone and everything. Cell was this haughty, entitled psychopath who validated his own superiority through the destruction of all living things. Both these characters were powerful, but what made them feel dangerous was the personality behind that power. And without that sense of character, the villains of Dragon Ball would just feel like walking power levels, which is exactly the problem with Super 17 and Omega Shenron. They just feel like plot obstacles for Goku to overcome, and when he inevitably does, there's never a sense that anything's really been achieved or that the lives of our characters have progressed at all. The defeat of each villain in GT is essentially a reset back to how things were at the beginning of the arc, meaning that by the time the final battle is won, things feel exactly like they did at the end of episode 1, those intense journeys of growth through struggle that defined Dragon Ball being completely absent from GT. And so, what we had in GT was a show that wore the skin of Dragon Ball but never grasped the underlying mechanics that made that story great. And that was frustrating. If you loved Dragon Ball, you likely wanted to love GT. You wanted to go on that same journey again and experience those same emotions. But that wasn't what we got, and it was hard not to feel burned by that. It was hard not to feel angry. So, what happened? How did one of Japan's best loved series turn into one of its most reviled? And the answer is simple and kind of sad. GT was the first Dragon Ball anime not based on the manga of Akira Toriyama, but instead— oh god, not again! GT was the first Dragon Ball anime not to be based on the manga of Akira Toriyama, instead being created purely by the internal staff at Toei. Toei being the company that animated the Dragon Ball Z anime, with Toriyama only providing some character design work and approving some of the early episode concepts. And so Toei made what they wanted to make, a cartoon marketed to children designed to keep that Dragon Ball merchandise machine spinning. and to retain that golden time slot of 7 PM Wednesday, until it was cancelled after a 64-episode run after what its creators would later describe as a divisive reception. Would the series have turned out any better if Toriyama had been more central in its creation? Honestly, I don't think it really would have. By 1996, Dragon Ball had been running for 10 years, meaning Toriyama had been creating manga for 16 years. And to put it plainly, dude was burnt out. What was, for so many people, a hugely important and formative piece of media was for him just the job he had to wake up to every morning and likely work on late into the night. And that took a physical and mental toll that could be plainly seen from interviews and author notes that came later on in his career. When Toriyama talks about Dragon Ball now, he speaks with a level of apathy that is honestly a little shocking. And so to me, Dragon Ball was done when Dragon Ball was done. And that's hard. I think it's easy to convince ourselves that media is this infinite ethereal thing that can last forever, when in actuality it's as finite as anything else, something that burns on the passion and creative energy of the people who make it, which, like all precious resources, is depletable and will eventually run out. And so all we can really do is accept that the things we love, the things that meant so much to us at certain points in our lives, they end, and we just have to let them go. It's with that in mind that I discovered something I was not expecting to from the outset of this video. And that was that upon rewatching Dragon Ball GT, I didn't hate it. I actually kind of enjoyed it. That might sound insane following everything I've said in the video thus far, and I do stand by those criticisms, especially in regards GT's fight scenes, but the fact is Dragon Ball Z entered my life at a point when I really needed it. And now I don't anymore. And with that expectation removed, I see GT not for what I wanted it to be, but what it is. A perfectly watchable kids show, and especially those first 16 episodes that now just feel like this weird, cool space adventure homage to the more innocent first 14 chapters of Dragon Ball. And I noticed things I never did before, like how nice the art direction occasionally is, that the fight with Nova Shenron is better than it has any right to be, or what a heartfelt send-off the final episode is to Dragon Ball. Especially that scene when Krillin and Goku have one last spar on the beach in front of Master Roshi's hut. And it's still the same series I watched from back then. The only thing that's changed is me. The only thing that's changed is us. And so, if you, like me, were infuriated by GT at a younger age, I don't know, maybe try it again sometime. And who knows, you might like it. Friends, thank you for joining me today. I really hope you enjoyed the video. A little announcement, I'm going to be making my yearly pilgrimage to MagFest on January 3rd. And so if you're going and would like to hang out, I'm going to be posting details of a meetup on Twitter, so be sure to follow me there. I'd like to give a huge shout out to my Wolfpack over on Patreon for their continued and incredible support. And if you would like to be among them, all you need is a single $1 and to head on over to patreon.com/super eyepatchwolf. This week in particular, I'd like to thank Android DX, Ice Cream Mouth, Sean Jen, Septi Art, Lover Hardcore, Proxy Bomb, and Jesse Hill. Find me as ever hosting the Let's Fight a Boss video game podcast or on Twitter at eyepatchwolf. Friends, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time. Vegeta's mustache is still fucking dumb though.